Okay, guys. So today we're going to continue working on the listening section, sorry. But we will be moving on to the second part of listening, which is lectures, right? Remember we said in the listening part, you guys will listen to two different types of content. The first one was conversation, the one that we practiced yesterday. And then you will also have to listen to lectures, right? Academic lectures. So today we're going to be working on the second part, academic lectures. Let's see what we have for the lectures parts of the list. So first of all, these lectures are always going to be academic. That means that they are going to be, do you guys remember what a lecture was? I think we saw this. What's a lecture?
¿Una charla?
Yeah, it's like una charla, una clase, the explanation of something, right? That's a lecture. So you guys are going to be listening to these lectures. They are going to last approximately 3 to 6 minutes, I would say. There are some lectures that are longer, 3 to 6 minutes, maybe an average 4 or 5. And you guys will have 6 questions per lecture. Okay? Now, the most important thing that we can say about these lectures is, I would say, the strategies to take notes will be probably the most important thing, and understanding the structure of lectures. Okay, guys? Let me see, there was one presentation we had. Okay. So these lectures are always going to be broken down in a way. In the beginning of the lecture, during the first, let's say, 30 seconds of it, you guys will hear a short introduction to the topic, where you will find the most important ideas, like the main ideas of the lecture. You need to pay close attention during those 30 seconds, because I'd say that's key in order to answer most of the questions. But then this topic is going to be broken down into different subtopics, and you guys will find a lot of facts and examples and classification, theories, definitions, sequence of events. And that is the most important part of every lecture, to understand how it's structured, how it's organized. So let me see. The thing is, if you guys understand how most lectures are usually structured, then it'll be easier for you to be an active listener. You'll be looking for specific information, and that will allow you to be more, to understand better the ideas. Okay, guys. So here's what I was telling you. Lectures can have different types of organizational styles. Organizational styles is the different ways in which information can be presented. For example, there are some that we have here. We have, for example, comparison and contrast. Okay, in comparison and contrast, as the name says, the professor will be comparing and contrasting two different elements. For example, maybe let's say we have the similarities and differences between World War II and World War I, right? So that's a comparison around countries because you guys will find the similarities and the differences. In that case, once you know that it's a comparison, you're already looking for that specific information, right? How is it similar? How is it different? Sometimes you have processes. Processes are basically sequence of events, right? Things that happen in a sequential way. Let's say, in this case, I think we have an example here. It says photosynthesis is a complex and vital mechanism utilized by plants to convert light energy into chemical energy. It begins with the absorption of sunlight by chlorophyll molecules in plant cells. As a result, water molecules are split, releasing oxygen. So in this case, they talk about a process, right? Photosynthesis. So in that case, they're going to talk about the different steps of the process. It begins with the absorption of sunlight. Then you have this other step, you have this other step. So it's the steps of a process. Comparison and contrast, we have an example here. It says, through Canada and the United States, though Canada and the United States are both countries in North America, they are exceedingly different in many ways. For example, the countries are of similar size. Yet Canada has 200,000 kilometers of coastline, while the US has about 1/10 of that. So they start looking at the differences and the similarities of both countries, right? That's comparison and contrast. Another one that is very common is classification. When you have the types of something, let's say that you have types of, let's say, we probably have an example here. Maybe we have, I don't know which one. Okay, let's give an example ourselves. Perhaps we have the example of types of pollution, right? So different types in which pollution can occur. Air pollution, water pollution, like maybe noise pollution. So we have different types of pollution, right? That's a classification. Usually when you guys have classification, you have different types, type 1, type 2, type 3, type 4, and each type has examples. So a type and its example. So air pollution, and then you have an example. Sometimes we have theory and support. Theory and support basically is theory and evidence, right? Maybe the theory of relativity proposed by Albert Einstein. And then you have pieces of evidence that support that theory. Cause and effect, which is basically cause and effect, right? Maybe the causes of pollution, the effects of pollution. What causes pollution? What consequences pollution has? Problems and solutions. So maybe, let's say that, I don't know. This is cause and effect, right? Greenhouse gas emissions and its effects, its consequences. Problem and solution, maybe we have number 6, because food insecurity is a pervasive problem affecting millions of people worldwide. Limited access to nutritious food leads to malnutrition, stunted growth, and increased vulnerability to diseases, particularly among marginalized populations. To address this issue, implementing sustainable agricultural practices and promoting local food production can play a significant role. So in that case, we have problem and solution, right? The problem is food insecurity, and then you have different solutions. The first one, agricultural practices. The second one, promoting local food. Problems and solutions. Maybe the problem is pollution, and you have different ways to solve that problem. And then you have advantages and disadvantages. So maybe it says, taking a loan for our education allow us to pursue higher education without immediate financial burden. We can focus on our studies and invest in our future. True, but we should also consider the drawbacks. Taking a loan means accumulating debt and having to pay it off with interest. It could take years to repay, impacting our financial freedom after graduation. So in this case, they are discussing the advantages, the pros, and the cons of taking a loan for educational purposes, right? The advantage would be that you can focus on your studies and invest in your future. And the drawbacks, the disadvantages would be that you're not going to be financially free after you graduate. So these are some of the different types of structures that you guys can have in the lectures. And it's essential that you guys are able to identify what structure your lecture has. And sometimes it can be a mix of different things. Sometimes at the beginning, it can start by a process, the description of the process, and then you can have the types. Maybe it starts with cause and effect, and then you have classification, or the other way around. It's not always going to be just one, but you need to understand these different organizational styles in order for you guys to follow the lecture more easily. Okay, guys, and pay active attention to what is going on. We're going to see some examples with actual lectures, don't worry about that. But I think it's important to at least name which ones these are. You know, compare and contrast, processes, classification, theory and support, cause and effect, problem solution, and pros and cons. Okay, guys? Do you have any questions so far? Is everything okay?
Yes, teacher.
Okay, perfect. So let's take a look at an example. Okay, and I will show you guys exactly what to do with an example. Let's see. Here. Okay, so initially we're just going to hear the first part of this lecture. We're not going to hear everything. And we're going to discuss a little bit of the structure of this lecture. Okay, guys? So initially, I just want you to hear the lecture. Don't take any notes, please. Just pay close attention to whatever the professor is saying, and then we'll discuss. Okay, guys? So don't take any notes. Let's hear.
Listen to part of a university lecture by a professor in the College of Fine Arts. Good morning, everyone. Today I want to start with a look at perspective, visual perspective. First, we'll look very briefly at the kinds of perspective, and then we'll look very quickly at its history in art. Just in case you don't know what we're discussing, perspective in art is the way that artists represent three-dimensional objects on the two dimensions of their canvas. There are two basic sorts of visual perspective: aerial perspective and linear perspective. Aerial perspective, and aerial just means air or atmospheric, not your view from an airplane. Aerial perspective is the way that the atmosphere affects how we see things, especially distant things. I won't try to go into the laws of physics that are involved here, but it is aerial perspective that makes a mountain in the distance appear to be a different color, that makes it seem hazier, less distinct than closer objects. These are effects that realistic artists attempt to reproduce carefully and that impressionists use to create their own effects. Just think of many of Turner's landscapes or cityscapes like his Ditto building Carthage to get an idea of how the air can affect what we see.
Okay, guys. So far, you heard the introduction and a little bit of the first subtopic. Can you guys tell me what this lecture is about? What was it about? Anybody? Let's look at the first part of the transcript. This is the introduction. The professor says, good morning, everyone. Today, I want to start with a look at perspective, visual perspective. First, we'll look briefly at the kinds of perspective, and then we'll look very quickly at its history in art. Just in case you don't know what we're discussing, perspective in art is the way that artists represent three-dimensional objects on the two dimensions of their canvas. That was the introduction, the first part, the first 30 seconds, let's say. So in this introduction, what does the professor mention? First of all, the professor greets the class, of course, good morning, everybody. But most importantly, the professor talks about the topic of the lecture, right? I want to start with a look at perspective, visual perspective. That is the topic of the lecture, right? Visual perspective. And the topic is always going to be presented in the introduction, in the first part of the lecture, guys. So it's really important that you guys hear and pay close attention to that introduction. And I would even suggest that you don't take notes yet during that first part. Just make sure that you understand what the topic is. Okay, guys? And then what else does the professor do? The professor also talks a little bit about the structure, the organizational style that we were saying of this lecture. Because the professor says, first, we'll look briefly at the kinds of perspective, and then we'll look very quickly at its history in art. Okay? Just by listening to that, you already know what the structure of the lecture will be. It will be first classification, right? Because kinds of perspective means classification, it means types. So we have classification, and then it says, and then we'll look very quickly at its history in art. History in art, it means sequence of events, right? History of something, historical novels, biographies are always sequence of events. What happened first, what happened later, what happened next. They're always a sequence of events. So they tell you the structure and they tell you the topic of the lecture. What else do? They gave you a short definition of the topic. So just in case you don't know what we're discussing, perspective in art is the way that artists represent three-dimensional objects onto the two dimensions of their canvas. That is way important as well. That's really important as well. That's way more important than other things. So it is key that you guys are able to understand what the topic is. You cannot just say it's about perspective without actually knowing what perspective is. So if you have a definition, an explanation, or even an example in the beginning of the lecture, in the introduction, then you should definitely write notes about that because it's going to be key and you will probably need it for the questions. Okay, guys? So that's what we had in the introduction. Is that okay so far? Do you have any questions at all? Okay, guys. Now, how is that important? Why is that important? First of all, because you will totally at least have one question in the beginning that asks you about this part, about the introduction. So there's always one question from the introduction, and 1 out of 6 is actually a lot. Now, another reason why this is so important is because once you guys understand what this lecture is about and how the organization of this lecture will be, then that means that you guys become an active listener. What do I mean by that? That you're going to be actively looking for specific information. You already know that this is classification. So what does that mean? That means that you're going to be looking for the types of perspective, 1 type, 2 types, 3 types, I don't know how many. And you're going to be looking for a definition of each type. What is that type? How is it? A description of it. And you'll also be looking at examples, right? You'll be looking for specific examples of each type. So what is the first type? how is it defined? What is the example for the first time? So you're looking for that specific information, and that's going to make it easier for you to understand and follow and take notes and everything. And then you know that it's history in art, so you can already expect what to hear. Maybe the origins of perspective. Who first defined perspective? Who first introduced this concept? Who first used perspective in art? Then what happened later? How it is spread? Where in which part of the world did this begin, right? So you're going to be looking for specific information, and that makes things easier for you. Okay, guys? So is that okay so far? Do you have any questions? Okay, guys. Now, if you realized exactly what we were saying, you have different topics, right? The professor started by talking about aerial perspective, which is the first type of perspective. The professor defines what aerial perspective is, and then the professor was giving an example or examples of visual perspective in art, of aerial perspective in art. So another thing that I want you guys to notice, if you guys see the transcript, you can see that the information is not organized in one entire paragraph, right? It's not just one paragraph. You have different paragraphs. It's not just one big thing. You have different paragraphs that organize the information if you see the transcript. Now, of course, you guys won't be able to see the transcript or to read the transcript, but this shows you that the information is organized in unities, in paragraphs, okay, in specific subtopics, sub-ideas, subdivisions. Not everything's about the same. Now, what I want you guys to do is I want you to pay attention to the content, but I also want you to pay attention to the way the professor speaks. Because if you realize, every time that the professor is finishing an idea and is starting a new idea, you have a small pause. The professor lowers his voice, makes a pause, and then raises his voice again. And I want you to pay attention to that. Let's hear this part right here.
In case you don't know what we're discussing, perspective in art is the way that artists represent three-dimensional objects on the two dimensions of their canvas. There are two basic sorts of visual perspective. Aerial perspective.
Right? So when the professor's here, two dimensions of their canvas. The professor makes a pause and then it starts again. There are two basic sorts of visual perspective, right? There's a little raising the voice and making a pause and everything. Same thing here. Let's go forward a little bit.
Realistic artists attempt to reproduce carefully, and that impressionists use to create their own effects. Just think of many of Turner's landscapes or cityscapes like his Ditto building Carthage to get an idea of how the air can affect what we see. Another perspective, linear perspective, is the way
Right? So the professor makes a pause before starting a new thing. Not only the pause, but also the words that the professor uses, right? Like another perspective, furthermore, moreover, for example. So those transitions are also going to help you, okay, guys? But you need to make sure that you identify when an idea ends and when the other one begins. Now, why? Why is it important for you guys to do that? Why should you make sure that you know when an idea ends and another one begins? Because that is going to determine how you take your notes, okay? Here is what you're going to do. I want to give you an example of how I take my notes. I want you guys to see a photo of one of my notes. Okay, guys. So this is a picture of an example of how you guys need to take your notes for the lectures. Okay? First of all, you need to make sure that your piece of paper or your whiteboard or whatever you're using to take notes, a transparent sheet or the whiteboard, needs to be on a horizontal position. Okay, it doesn't have to be vertical, it has to be horizontally placed. And what you guys need to do is divide your paper into 9 different boxes. You have to create 9 different boxes by drawing lines or by folding your paper if you want as well, depending, I mean, it's up to you. But you need to make sure that you divide your paper into 9 different boxes. Okay, guys? And what you're going to do is you're going to start taking notes here. So maybe you will have a few notes about the introduction in this part, in this first box. And every time that the professor starts a new idea, a new paragraph, you're going to move on to the next box. So you start taking notes right here in the first one. And then when the professor starts a new idea, so let's say that you have the introduction here. What is visual perspective, the introduction, and that's it. Then you notice that the professor is starting with the first type, aerial perspective. So these are going to be your notes for aerial perspective. You write down the definition, the examples, and that's it. Then the professor starts with the other one, linear perspective, and then you move on to the next box. And then you write down the definition, their examples. Then let's say the professor talks about the history. So you move on to the next box and you're like history, the origin of perspective. You write down all of the details. Then when the professor moves on to another topic, you move on to the next box. Okay, guys? It is very recommended to have your notes structured like this because this allows you, first of all, to have organized notes. And you will know when an idea was mentioned, in what topic. So for example, if there's a question that says, why does the professor mention this house here? Then you know that it's going to be related to the first type of perspective. You know that it's probably going to be an example of aerial perspective. But if you take your notes all disorganized, then you won't know why the professor talks about certain things or where they belong. So it's important that you guys have your notes organized from like in categories or in subtopics. And also this allows you to not use a lot of space because to be honest, it's really common that students start writing down their notes in one page and then they use another page to do it to complete their notes, or sometimes if they have to wipe the whole thing up. So I would really recommend that you try taking notes in this way. Okay, guys? Is it okay so far? Is it clear? Do you have any questions before we actually start listening to the lecture and seeing the questions? Everything clear? Okay, that's perfect. So in that case, I am now going to play the entire lecture and I want you guys to take notes in that way. All right, so I want you all to get a piece of paper or get your whiteboards ready. And I want you to draw 4 lines so that you divide the paper into 9 different boxes. Okay, guys, try to do that. 9 different boxes. Are you guys ready? Do I play the lecture? Okay, guys, so let's hear it.
Listen to part of a university lecture by a professor in the College of Fine Arts. Good morning, everyone. Today I want to start with a look at perspective, Visual perspective. First, we'll look very briefly at the kinds of perspective, and then we'll look very quickly at its history in art. Just in case you don't know what we're discussing, perspective in art is the way that artists represent three-dimensional objects on the two dimensions of their canvas. There are two basic sorts of visual perspective: aerial perspective and linear perspective. Aerial perspective, and aerial just means air or atmospheric, not your view from an airplane. Aerial perspective is the way that the atmosphere affects how we see things, especially distant things. I won't try to go into the laws of physics that are involved here, but it is aerial perspective that makes a mountain in the distance appear to be a different color, that makes it seem hazier, less distinct than closer objects. These are effects that realistic artists attempt to reproduce carefully and that impressionists use to create their own effects. Just think of many of Turner's landscapes or cityscapes like his Ditto building Carthage to get an idea of how the air can affect what we see. Another perspective, linear perspective, is the way that things seem to get smaller the farther away they get. A classic example of this is the way we perceive railroad tracks or a line of telephone poles running away from us. They seem to get smaller and smaller as they recede, until they vanish in a point on the horizon. And this point is appropriately called the vanishing point. This effect happens whenever there are parallel lines like the two train tracks or the tops and bottoms of the telephone poles. Now, an object or a scene may have more than one vanishing point. A cube, with one of its faces squarely perpendicular to us, has a single vanishing point, directly behind it and on the horizon. But a cube with one of its vertical edges facing us has two vanishing points instead, one for the right-hand face and one for the left-hand face. And these points are off to the right and left respectively, on the horizon, where the parallel lines of the faces seem to converge. And then, if this same cube is viewed from somewhat above or below, it will have three vanishing points, one to the right, one to the left, and a third one behind it and below or above the horizon. This is easy to visualize if you look up at a corner building from its street intersection. You can look down one street to see the right-hand vanishing point, look down the cross street to see the left-hand vanishing point, and then look up along the corner of the building to visualize the third vanishing point. These kinds of perspective are easy to see if we view geometrical shapes or man-made structures. But of course, natural scenes don't have any sets of parallel lines, so they have no vanishing points. But that doesn't mean that they don't exhibit perspective. The laws of optics were not understood at all in early Western art. Artists recognized the effect, of course, but they were unable to figure out how to represent it accurately. From the paintings inside the Egyptian pyramids to the illustrations in medieval Christian churches, nearer people were simply drawn larger, or drawn lower in the picture, or drawn so as to cover the people farther away. There was no real understanding of how the physics of perception worked. They never got a grasp on the idea of the vanishing point. And then came the Renaissance, the rebirth of learning and the sciences. This was a hotbed of scientific thought. Da Vinci, Galileo, Newton, and Filippo Brunelleschi. Brunelleschi was a 15th century Florentine architect who conducted several optical experiments and discovered the rules of perspective. With what he learned, he drew a very accurate picture of San Giovanni Baptistry in Florence, and then he made a small peephole in the middle of it. He carried it into the street and amazed all his acquaintances by having them look through the peephole from the back of his picture, first at a mirror which reflected the image into the viewer's line of sight. Then, Brunelleschi would quickly withdraw the mirror, leaving the viewer peeping at the real baptistry, whose perspective had been replicated perfectly. Other Italian artists, notably Donatello, began using Brunelleschi's methods for accurate linear perspective, and his ideas soon spread throughout Europe. The development of effective aerial perspective, on the other hand, was developed by the Flemish and Dutch masters of this same period, and can be seen at its best in works like Jan van Eyck's The Virgin of Chancellor Roland. But that's another story.
Okay, guys. So how was the lecture? What would you guys say? Any questions? Was it clear? Were you guys able to understand the main ideas, at least, of the lecture? First of all, we have the classification, right? The first type was aerial perspective. What was the second type? Linear perspective, right? We have aerial and linear perspective. And then they talk about vanishing points as well. I think they mention examples of 1 vanishing point, 2 vanishing points, and 3 vanishing points. And finally, they talk about the history of perspective in art. They talk about the first person who understood the physics or the science behind art, who introduced the concept of perspective, right? We had examples, then they talk about how perspective is spread throughout Europe, and finally, some other artists that started using perspective. Let's take a look at the questions now, shall we? The first question says, what is this lecture mainly about? What do you guys think? This is the main idea question type, right? It's about the first part, the introduction that we talked about. So what is this lecture mainly about?
An optical effect.
Okay, do you guys agree? Do you all agree? Why an optical effect?
Because an optical effect is the definition of perspective, I think. So I deduce it.
Exactly, perfect, Fernando. Yes, exactly that. We know that this lecture, first always try to answer the questions on your own. Try to answer the questions by yourself, not necessarily using the answer choices. So what is this lecture about? We know that it's about visual perspective. And then you gotta choose the option that gets closer to what you said, right? So what is the closest one from the options to visual perspective? Well, an optical effect, because yes, as Fernando said, the definition of visual perspective was the way that an artist can represent three-dimensional objects onto the 2 dimensions of their canvas. So it's an optical effect, right? Representing something that has 3 dimensions in a 2-dimensional canvas. So it's an optical effect. Perfect. Yes, let's choose that. Okay, guys, careful not to choose other options that seem to have synonyms, but that are not really correct. For example, option C, an artistic viewpoint. Viewpoint is true that it's a synonym of perspective, right? It's a synonym of the word perspective, but not in this context. Viewpoint is a synonym of the word perspective in the context of opinion, right? Like my perspective, my viewpoint, my opinion, not in the artist way. So careful. Okay, guys. Now question 2. Maybe Mateo, could you please read the second question?
Sure, teacher. Which is a characteristic of realistic landscape paintings?
Which is a characteristic of realistic landscape paintings. What do you guys think? This is a detailed question. What would you say? Does anyone know?
The first one, they have many vanishing points.
Okay, do you guys agree? Does everyone agree?
Yeah, teacher, I think it's the first one.
I am not really sure. Do you guys have anything related to landscape paintings or realistic landscape paintings in your notes? And where is it?
Can you repeat, teacher?
Do you have anything related to realistic landscapes in your landscape paintings in your notes?
Not really, but I uh, I remember that vanishing points were a topic that the professor described a lot of times.
Okay, but the professor also talks about other topics as well, right? I think atmospheric effects is related to what? To aerial perspective, right? If you guys remember what aerial perspective is related to atmospheric effects, aerial perspective. Now, unclear from a distance is related to linear perspective. And appearing the Renaissance is related to the history of perspective in art, right? So if you guys can remember, and vanishing points is just vanishing points, right? If you remember anything about landscape paintings or if you have it in your notes, ask yourself, where is it? Is it in the part of aerial perspective or linear perspective, vanishing points or history in art? Because remember that that's why we have our information in order. We're going to choose vanishing points, but to be honest, I think it's an example of aerial perspective. So I think I would go for they show atmospheric effects. And also, if you guys didn't know the answer and you had to choose randomly, if you had to guess, then always make sure that you think or you suppose you assume that the questions are going to go in the same order as the information was delivered. So that means that the first question should be about the main idea, the second should be about aerial, the third should be about linear, then you should have something about vanishing points, and then something about art. Obviously, this is not always going to be 100% true, but if you didn't know the answer and you had to guess, then that can be a good help, right? Now, the second question or the third question, it says, maybe, Walter, can you please read the question?
Yes, teacher. Why does the professor mention Turner's painting, Tito Building Cathay?
Okay, thank you so much. So why does the professor mention this? Anyone? It's kind of the same, right? The most important part is when does the professor mention these buildings? Was it when they were talking about aerial perspective, vanishing points, linear perspective, or multiple vanishing points? When does the professor talk about this? Anyone? Okay, guys, so if you don't know, you have to guess. So which one would you choose?
Maybe the last one, teacher.
Right, maybe. Another thing, if you didn't know and you have to choose, let's say that the preview already had a question about aerial perspective, then it's very unlikely that you will have two about aerial perspective. I'm not saying that it's, I mean, it's never going to happen, but it's more likely that you have one question per subtopic rather than you have like 3 questions about the same. Okay, just talking about possibilities and probabilities here, not necessarily certainties. Now, question 4. Maybe Ignacio, could you read what question 4 says?
Okay, teacher. According to the professor, what was the Renaissance conducive to art?
Okay, guys, so what do you think? Why was it conducive to art? Anyone? If you don't know, take a guess. Take an educated guess. Well, I don't think that, for example, it debunked earlier theories of perspective. I think that's not correct, right? Because I think the Renaissance was when the first theories of perspective started to begin, right? So there weren't any earlier theories of perspective. I don't know, it permitted the Dutch masters to develop linear perspective. I don't know if that's true either, because they didn't talk about linear perspective only. European thought, scientific curiosity, linear perspective. What do you guys think? Anyone? You have to guess if you don't know, so which one would you choose? I think it was somewhere here, right? Maybe we can play this part again.
To geometrical shapes or man-made structures. But of course, natural scenes don't have any sets.
That's vanishing points.
Galileo, Newton, and Filippo Brunelleschi. There was no real understanding of how the physics of perception worked. They never got a grasp on the idea of the vanishing point. And then came the Renaissance, the rebirth of learning and the sciences. This was a hotbed of scientific thought. Da Vinci, Galileo, Newton, and
So, why was the Renaissance conducive to art? Because it created an atmosphere of scientific curiosity, right? The professor says that before the Renaissance, they didn't know anything about perspective, right? And then the professor is like, and then came the Renaissance, the rebirth of learning and the sciences. So the Renaissance was when art started mixing with science, right? And it created this atmosphere of scientific curiosity where people started experimenting, searching for more precise methods, and they created the theory of perspective. Right? Now, question 5 says, foreshortening is a way of representing an object so that it conveys the illusion of depth, and its success often depends upon a point of view in which the sizes of near and far parts of an object contrast greatly. Foreshortening is an instance of what? Is an example of what? What do you guys say? What is the type of perspective, or what is the topic that talks about the illusion of depth, in which its success depends on upon a point of view in which the sizes of near and far parts of an object contrast greatly? What was the topic? Where they talk about depth, where they talk about contrasting sizes of near and far parts of an object? You guys remember? That was linear perspective, right? It says linear perspective is the way that things seem to get smaller the farther away they get. So it's about the sizes, smaller, bigger, and about depths, right? Distances. A classic example of this is the way we perceive railroad tracks on a line of telephone poles running away from us. They seem to get smaller and smaller as they recede until they vanish, right? So an example of or this would be an example of linear perspective. So let's check our answers. So the first one was great. It's an optical effect. That is the definition of visual perspective. A characteristic of realistic landscape paintings is that they show atmospheric effects, right? The Turner's painting the Ditto building Carthage is an example of aerial perspective, not vanishing points. The Renaissance was conducive to art because it created an atmosphere of scientific curiosity, and linear perspective would have this example of foreshortening. So if we hear aerial perspective, we have two questions that are wrong about that. Yeah. It should be somewhere here.
Listen to history. In case you don't know what we're discussing, perspective in art is the traditional. There are two basic sorts of visual perspective. Aerial perspective, and aerial just means air or atmospheric, not your view from an airplane. Aerial perspective is the way that the atmosphere affects how we see things, especially distant things. I won't try to go into the laws of physics that are involved here, but it is aerial perspective that makes a mountain in the distance appear to be a different color, that makes it seem hazier, less distinct than closer objects. These are effects that realistic artists attempt to reproduce carefully and that impressionists use to create their own effects. Just think of many of Turner's landscapes or cityscapes like his Ditto building Carthage to get an idea of how the air can affect what we see.
Right. So aerial perspective, I mean, they use the example of realistic landscapes to talk about or to illustrate the concept of aerial perspective. Right? They talk about mountains, they talk about landscapes, Turner's landscape, realistic artists. So realistic landscape paintings show atmospheric effects. Right? It's an example of aerial perspective. And Turner's painting, it was an example of aerial perspective as well. Okay, guys? So I know that right now it seems a little complicated. It is complicated, I won't lie to you, but I'd say it takes overall practice. You know, it's about practicing as much as you can. And it definitely takes other skills as well, for sure, like note taking, vocabulary that you have to improve. But in reality, what I would suggest that you guys do if you really want to improve your listening skills is listening to at least one lecture every day. So if every day while you guys are on the bus, while you're waiting for someone, while you are, even when you're driving, while you're going to work, whatever it is that you're doing, if you have some time, try to listen. You have headphones on and you can listen to different podcasts, to those lectures, anything at all that is academic. Okay, obviously don't listen to, like, let's say music, because that's not academic. Listen to academic content. You can watch National Geographic videos, TED Talks, TED Education, business podcasts, whatever that is academic, where you can also see the transcripts. Okay, guys? So what do you think now? Don't worry about this. Tomorrow we'll practice. We'll do as many questions as we can. But what do you think so far? Do you have any questions about what we did today? Is everything clear? Everything okay so far? Okay, guys. Then please don't forget today's daily survey before you go. And I will be seeing you guys next class.
Bye, teacher.
Bye, guys.
Bye, teacher.
Bye, Mateo.